Hello and welcome. My name is Allison Van and I'm the Executive Director of CRESS, the Center for Research in Empirical Social Sciences, which as of January 1st will be officially renamed SPARC, a Center for Social Research Innovation. This is our Productivity During Pandemics series where we invite people doing very interesting research from around the world to come share a snippet of what they're working on with us. I'd like to start by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who are here before us and to recognize our responsibility as guests to honor and respect the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. Laura Mahrenbach is a research fellow and lecturer at the Technical University of Munich School of Governance. Laura's research focuses on the intersection of global power shifts, global governance, and technological innovation, particularly big data. She's currently the principal investigator on a 3-year German Research Foundation-funded project on conceptualizing emerging powers. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura.
Thanks for having me, Allison. Yeah, right. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you to Allison, to Cress, and to everyone else, and to Supriya as well, who gave me a whole lot of organizational detail help. I don't know if she's here or not, but she was excellent. Anyway, yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit today about a project that we have ongoing at the Technical University of Munich. It deals with emerging powers and big data. And this project really started from the realization that 2 things are going on in the world related to data use and governance that we thought were very interesting. The first one deals with the changing patterns of data use and governance. So at the national level, data used to be something that was sort of governed in a paragraph in the national security strategy or in a paragraph in the memos for trade negotiators. Nowadays, national governments see data as something that deserves its own strategy and needs to be governed in its own right. If we move up to the international level, we can look at international organizations. One thing that they're saying nowadays is we have different modes of internet governance than we had before. Maybe we should try some of them out instead of just sticking with the one dominant multi-stakeholder model that has been dominant for so long. Another thing that we see at the international level with the IOs is that they're seeing data increasingly not just as something to collect and put together and use, but they want to see it as a tool for development, something that really you can sort of develop in a way that makes good outcomes happen in a way that was not possible before. The third thing we're seeing at the international level is that multinational corporations who have always really been involved in things like providing infrastructure or increasing internet access, all of a sudden they're interested in governance as well, right? They want to help solve grand challenges. They want to make things better, hypothetically, at least that's what they say, for people in the developing world. And so all of these things have coming together all at the same time is a really interesting trend that we noticed. The second thing that we noticed is that digital capabilities appear to be concentrating. And specifically, they appear to be concentrating around China, the US, and the EU. Now, I just got some examples from here on the screen. This one up here, you can see is the performance share of the top 500 supercomputers by country. In 1999, clearly the US was dominant. 20 years later, we see a very clear split between the US and China. And this is a huge advance. And actually, they just released the new numbers. So I'm interested to see what happened in 2020, but that's something else. Here we can see another example. These are the patent applications by residents around the world. If you look, this pale blue line here is China. So in 1980, China had no patents, or at least according to the data. According to the World Bank, they had none. By 2018, you can see they're clearly the world leader. And these down here, the pale blue in the USA, let's see, dark blue and medium blue are the EU and the US. And they're also holding their own against the rest of the world. If you move over to the right, here we see another measure of digital capabilities. In this case, it's active social media users. And the active social media users are clearly dominated by the US, but increasingly so. At the same time, China's catching up, right? And the EU is essentially nowhere to be seen. The EU is on par with the rest of the world in this case. So this was another interesting trend we thought deserved a little bit more attention. Now, this got us to thinking about what it means in terms of changes in the world. And one thing that could happen as a result of these trends is that we could see some huge domestic transformations taking place, right? How data is used, how data is governed. At the same time, somehow or another, it's all linked up to power shifts, right? There's something global power shifty about the idea that digital capabilities are concentrating around the world. So we got to thinking and we thought, well, how can we examine this? And the idea that we had is that to look at the emerging powers and the so-called leading powers and see how they're getting involved in data use and governance around the world and what kinds of things we can learn from that. Specifically, what we do is focus on big data in our project. And we look at these 5 actors here: Brazil, India, China, the EU, and the US. Now, in this talk, let me see if it'll click. In this talk, I want to talk about, oh, there it is. I want to talk just about this left-hand side, right? We're just going to talk about Brazil, India, and China. However, if you want to know more about these guys, we can talk about it in the Q&A at the end. So let's talk about Brazil, India, and China. They're doing a lot of stuff with big data. Some of this stuff involves things like crowd control. So up here on the left-hand side where you see the pointer, that's a religious festival in India. And they used both, they used big data both for crowd control and also for predictive policing. So essentially the idea that they wanted to diminish you know, thieves from attacking people or violent people from another religion from interrupting the festival. Here is another example. This is China's project. I think it's with IBM. I can't read it myself. Yeah, I think it's with IBM to use big data to improve the environment, right? By collecting different areas of pollution at different times of the year and see what happens. Here's a predictive policing program in Brazil. Here's a digital identification program in India. So you see all sorts of really neat stuff happening. And this is the kind of stuff we want to talk about today in this talk. Specifically, what I'm going to do is talk about 3 things. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what I've learned and what my co-authors have learned about the policy visions of big data arising in Brazil, India, and China. Second, we're going to talk a bit about the domestic transformations that are linked to these policy visions. And finally, we'll finish it up by talking about the implications for global power shifts and what we can learn from our research that may be helpful for understanding how Brazil, India, and China engage in data governance and use at the global level. So if there are no questions, I'm going to dive right in. Policy visions of big data we thought was a good place to start because the government's policy vision, it has 2 parts, right? The first part is, what do you want to do? And the second part is, how are we going to do it? So in this project, which came out in the Third World Quarterly 2 years ago, what we did is we wanted to essentially establish, first of all, what Brazil, India, and China want to do with big data. Then we wanted to determine if these were viable policy visions. Could they actually do it? And then the third thing that we wanted to do was generate advice in the Global South about how using big data could be helpful or how you could cooperate to use big data and so forth. Now, what we did is we performed a content analysis of a whole bunch of strategy documents and laws that came out in Brazil and India and China since the early 2000s. And the first thing we look for, right, because we want to answer that what question, is what are the policy visions? Now here you can see a sort of spider-like figure with the results. We essentially found, as you can see, 3 main policy visions related to big data in these countries. The first is that they saw big data as a tool for enhancing political liberation of citizens or increasing political repression of citizens. And I should just say that the liberation was largely overwhelmingly much more important than repression, but you did actually see governments talking about increasing surveillance as a part of big data, for example, or decreasing transparency of policymaking. And it wasn't just China. Second, one thing we saw is that the second vision deals with government service improvement. So here the idea is that you can use big data to increase the effectiveness of government services or even to increase the efficiency of their services by knowing who's accessing what, when, and how it can be better distributed. The third vision that we saw was very popular was development, right? And here the idea is that there's all sorts of different kinds of development that you can encourage, whether it's good educational programs or giving new opportunities to businesses in your country. So that's the what, right? Clearly they're all sharing these visions to a certain extent. It's important to note that they don't emphasize them equally. So even though everybody thinks Brazil, India, and China all think it's a good idea to sort of use big data for these purposes, they emphasize them to a different extent. So were they to cooperate on this, they'd have to sort of deal with those differences in emphases, because that could be maybe a bit of a problem. Now, policy visions don't matter if you can't do them, right? So the next thing we did to check the viability was to see to what extent the strategy documents and the laws actually name actors who were responsible and supposed to be held accountable for doing these things, right? For achieving these visions. What you see here is very clear that in all three of the BICs, the government set the pace and the direction. It's the government in charge, and they're deciding. You can see this here, 45.1% of the actors who were named were some kind of government actor. The other thing we see is that there's a relatively limited role for individuals, and this is particularly true for citizens and voters, right? Nobody had much of a role for individuals in these strategy documents, and interestingly, a lot of those roles that they did have were passive ones. So for example, the government provides you big data, or you sit there and you're at, by being in a certain traffic light, you have now contributed to big data objectives just by being there. Well, you were going to be there anyway, so you didn't actually do anything, right? So this is really what we're seeing. Now, if you zoom out and think about what we're learning, the first thing that we learn is that the BICs are not just happening to use big data, as is often said, right? Some people will claim, oh, well, they're involved in the global economy, and this is why they have to use big data. Or, oh, well, they partnered with the World Bank, and this is why they have to use big data. No, clearly they're using big data because they have a plan for big data. And that plan is both intentional, politically savvy, and pragmatic in how they are implementing it. The second things that we learned is that governments are really dominating in terms of strategizing what to do with big data and implementing big data in a way that is useful for their citizens, or hypothetically at least useful. So this got us to thinking again, what does it mean for citizens if governments are really dominating that process? And this leads me into part 2 of the talk, where our focus is really not just on what is big data and what's it good for, but also how is big data actually transforming domestic contexts and domestic relationships in these 3 countries. The first part of this section deals with the paper that I think caught your attention and the reason I got invited. This came out this year, and last year as an early view in the Canadian Journal of Communication. And this is a collaboration with my friend and colleague, Katja Meyer at the University of Vienna. And Katja and I were thinking, okay, what do we do if we want to know how citizens play a role in using big data in these countries? Well, one thing we could do is look at how big data actually interacts with citizens' lives. What does it do to them? How does it affect them? And the second thing we could do is we could look at specifically traditional relationships that citizens have. And obviously the most traditional relationship you have as a citizen is with your government in some respects. So how is actually big data expected to change citizen-government relations? Fortunately for us, we had already collaborated on the previous paper, so we had a big corpus of data that we could work with. And in the intervening time, this corpus had gotten bigger because, of course, governments had passed more laws and released more strategy documents. You can see some examples right here in the middle from China, from India, and from Brazil. These things we analyzed just as before, but instead of looking for policy visions, what we looked for this time are the issue areas in which big data was active. Is big data a tool in politics? Is it involved in the economy and education, environment, health, science, security? The other thing we wanted to think about is, well, how is it actually framed? Is it something where you have to think about political accountability, or are we really more concerned with human rights and privacy protections? Is it dealing with transparency, or is it a force for law and order? Well, these questions are the ones that we were looking to answer. We thought that by answering them, we could get a little bit more information about how big data is affecting individuals' lives, and also how it's changing the relationship between governments and citizens. Here's what we found. First, big data is pervasive. It's everywhere if you consider it in terms of issue areas. There were a lot of challenges and opportunities mentioned, and not just in one issue area or two, but in all issue areas in relation to big data. Let me just give you some examples. In terms of challenges, you could think about there's new security threats arising from big data. These are personal security threats that may also be cybersecurity threats. You also see the potential of being excluded from all the good opportunities, because if you don't engage in big data, if you don't learn as you should, you may actually not have the opportunity to benefit from all the good things that big data can bring. In terms of opportunities, we see something similar. You might have better access to educational opportunities. You might have new job opportunities or new opportunities for research. Or you might get involved in policy making in a way that you never were before. So this is the first point. Big data is pervasive and also both positive and negative. The second thing we see is that government agendas, and maybe this is unsurprising given what we found before, are ever present in the way that big data interacts with citizens' lives. Now, in China and India, what we see is that big data is very functional. The government see it as a means of improving services, for example, by creating a platform where people can upload information about a certain proposed law and give their opinion. And then the government can collate it, and then everything will be fine and everybody's connected, right? In Brazil, it's a bit more political. It's all about individualism and making sure that things are modern and up to date and sort of less fixing little problems and more sort of altering big structures, right? So that's what we found in the first part. Regarding our second question of citizen-government relationships, we saw that really they are changing if you look at big data information. So for example, you see that in all three of the BICs, big data is seen as a means of enhancing government oversight. For example, by getting more transparency into the policymaking process or by identifying corrupt officials and holding them accountable. What you also see, though, is that this is happening at different rates in different states. So, for example, in Brazil and India, we see evidence that big data could be helpful for substantially enhancing political participation. Whereas in China, it's more limited. In the Chinese platforms, for example, are often topic specific. No way of adding anything new. You just have to comment on that one thing that's there. In Brazil and India, it's a lot more open. The same thing goes for the political processes. In Brazil and India, it's leading to maybe a fundamentally different political process where citizens are proposing new laws, for example, and using referenda and petitions to advance those laws with the help of technology. In China, this process is more restricted. It's, like I said, generally limited to commenting on things. Now, what we thought when we got here was, okay, this is really pervasive. It looks like government and citizen relationships are changing, and it looks like big data is everywhere, which means that in the future, to be successful in implementing a big data project, you probably need to think a lot about how to legitimize that project. Why? Because they're expensive, confusing, require special skills, et cetera, et cetera. But how do we go and think about the legitimization or the legitimation of big data projects? Well, one thing to do is to just do a case study. And this is the route we took. Now here what you see is an ongoing project. It's currently under review, so it's not published yet. Hopefully it will be soon, we don't know. This project was looking at political legitimation of the world's biggest demographic and biometric database, namely AADHAAR. AADHAAR occurs in the world's largest democracy. And what we wanted to look at is how you can see legitimation through one of the world's biggest social media platforms, namely Twitter. If there's any case where political legitimation matters, it seems like this would be a good one. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, the AADHAAR program, like I said, is the world's largest demographic and biometric database. It collects data like your fingerprints, your iris scan. It also collects personal data like who your parents are, where you grew up, where you were born, how old you are, things like that. And it stores it on servers and can be used for all sorts of different things in the Indian context. So for example, you get an AADHAAR number and you can register for a school exam. You can provide your health records to a doctor in a different state. You can apply for a job. You can get a telephone contract. So there's lots of different uses for it. This is administered by the Unique Identification Authority of India. And actually, as the government was implementing it, they sold it as increasing the financial inclusion and the social protection of Indian residents. Now, quickly after its implementation, the criticism, as usual, comes. And the criticism points were mainly threefold. First, citizens and residents criticized it for being very expensive. There was a lot of infrastructure that had to be built. The second thing, they criticized it for not taking very good care of privacy, of data privacy. And third, there was a whole lot of political messiness involved in the creation of the program. So specific channels that were not taken the way they should be, a lot of which were then ended up in front of the Indian Supreme Court for decisions. So there's all of these legitimacy claims from the Indian government going on. And what we wanted to do is evaluate and measure the extent to which tweeters accepted these claims. Did they actually attribute legitimacy to this big data program? Now, the first thing we did was get a whole bunch of tweets, right? From 2009 to 2019, we collected tweets daily. And we ran a sentiment analysis. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with sentiment analysis, essentially what it does is track emotions in textual writing. So you can see whether they're positive emotions or negative emotions, and you can also see what kinds of happy and sad emotions might appear. Now, what we found, as you can see here, is that from 2009, when AADHAAR was implemented, to 2019, 10 years later, there was a clear and dramatic increase in negative emotions, while positive emotions sort of floundered around at the bottom. Specifically, the negative emotions we saw were anger and anxiety. Now, this is all well and good, but unfortunately for us, sentiment analysis doesn't tell you why anything happens. It just shows you what happens. So we decided to take a qualitative look. And what we found out when we looked at the actual tweets themselves, contents of the tweets, is that by the end of the 10 years, tweeters were seeing more costs than benefits arising from the program. This was particularly true amongst poorer citizens who, for example, may not have a thumbprint left after working in the fields for 40 years, and therefore not be able to access their welfare payments if it's only dependent on AADHAAR. There were also a lot of concerns about technological issues. So if the infrastructure doesn't work and you can't identify yourself with your cell phone or with your iPrint or your fingerprint or your eye scan, then you're kind of in a similar boat as the poor people with no fingerprints, right? So these technological issues were quite an issue for tweeters. And the other thing that aggravated them a lot was the handling of privacy concerns. They were concerned that there were data leaks, which is true, on a regular basis, that the servers, which were supposed to be totally separate, like biometric data here, demographic data here, so that at least if they got one, they wouldn't get the other, were not totally divided the way they were supposed to be. And this ultimately, in the end, led us to conclude that this is a case of legitimacy lost. There was a lot of hope at the beginning of the program. You can see this in sort of these lines that show the trends here, many of which then just decreased later. So if we want to zoom out from this, right? If we want to think, what did we learn about citizens and governments? And how does this relate to anything else we want to know? The first thing we can see is that there are significant domestic transformations arising from big data. We see changes in how actors relate with one another. We also see changes in how data is being used to do things in this country, in these countries. Now, importantly, regardless of issue area or actor, these changes are inherently political, and they're even being politicized more and more. So even if it's just something, I don't know, related to identifying yourself as a person, as an individual, right? A digital identification program like AADHAAR. If it's linked to your chances for a school exam or linked to your chances for healthcare, something's political about that. And we need to understand how this politicization is happening. At the same time, the other thing we're learning is that even though it was an undercurrent, these policy visions, right? And these uses of big data all take place within a context where the governments view themselves as increasingly influential and important on the world stage. So they're not just doing it because they want their citizens to do better. AADHAAR, the Indian government is very proud of AADHAAR being the world's largest demographic and biometric database. They say it over and over and over and over again. So it's clearly also a status claim. So if we're going to understand how things are happening, if we're going to understand what it matters for international affairs, well, we need to understand how these kinds of activities relate to the global power shifts that we're seeing. And that's the next part of the talk and the thing that I'd like to conclude with. So maybe just a little bit of background before we move into to the conclusions. Global power is clearly shifting. There's a huge literature that discusses the rise of the so-called emerging powers. And at the center of this literature are these guys here. These are the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, of whom, of course, our three guys, Brazil, India, and China, are main actors. Now, the BRICS mattered to global affairs because they're economically strong, right? They have a lot of material capabilities that can be used in a lot of different ways. They're geopolitically ambitious, meaning they're trying to make a presence on the world stage and trying to exert more influence over what's happening there. And also they're recognized as being distinct. They're not just your average developing country, but somehow they also don't fit as a developed country. They're somewhere in between. And as a result, they often assume both roles. And this makes them very interesting, both analytically and empirically. Even more interesting for us in this context is that it puts them in a unique position to really shape how data is being governed and how it's being used in world affairs. So what can we learn from our research on policy visions and legitimation that is relevant to how these global power shifts are occurring in the realm of digital governance? Well, if we want to look at data governance directly, the first thing we can say is that, okay, we saw shared policy visions. Could these shared policy visions be a platform for the BRICS to sort of assume global leadership in data governance? Well, you can see here's some examples here on the right. The BRICS, this is Xi Jinping of China, and this is the former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. The BRICS are taking charge in setting up new events related to internet governance. This one here is the World Internet Forum, the World Internet Conference. This is the Net Mundial, which we'll talk about in a second. And down here, India has also hosted the Internet Governance Forum, which is one of the major data governance meetings in the world. If you want to zoom in on Net Mundial, the interesting thing is that this meeting was created in the wake of the Snowden scandal. Essentially, Brazil was really mad when it found out the US had been spying on the cell phone of its president right before its diplomatic visit. Then the Brazilian president gave this big speech at the UN where she sort of maligned the US for spying on the world and said Brazil's going to do something about it. And Brazil was one of the countries that subsequently organized the Net Mundial as a way of sort of restructuring internet governance for the world. Now, the interesting thing for us is that the content basis of Net Mundial was to a large extent the same as these big data visions we identified, development and improving government efficiency and effectiveness using technology. The other interesting thing is that despite these being shared visions of Brazil, India, and China, there was still a lot of geopolitical bickering about Net Mundial because there are all these other geopolitical concerns that affect their behavior in data governance, just like they do in economic policy or security policy. So yes, maybe we will see shared policy visions as a basis for global leadership, but we have to understand that that will only happen within the context of these fights and these disagreements that these countries are already having. The second thing maybe we can learn in relation to data governance is that we saw that there was the desire to export shared visions. I didn't talk about it much today, but we can talk about it more if you want to. Brazil, India, and China want their policy vision of big data to be useful for the global south. Now, this has the potential to expand the reach of their governance, for example, and their governance use and how they think data can be governed in the national level and also at the international level. I can think of 3 different ways this could happen. It could happen through mirroring effects. So, for example, Brazil says, I govern data in this way and it works. And so Peru says, okay, I'll do it that way too. Works for you, works for me. Another way that it can work is through cash transfers. So for example, maybe Brazil, India, or China provide some money to build some data infrastructure, but they only provide it if that infrastructure reinforces the citizen-government relationship that they support, and not another one. And the last idea is through geo-economic competition. China, for example, organizes an event called the Big Data Expo every year, and has since 2016. The Big Data Expo is on paper a means of bringing big data companies around the world together, showcasing new technologies, and seeing how everybody can connect. In truth, if you look at the participant list, they tend to be at least 2/3 Chinese companies on the world stage being presented to the rest of the world, right? So this would also be a good means of sort of elbowing your own data governance perspective into the spotlight. So that's it in terms of data governance. I think that's a lot of potential for future research, and I think also a lot of potential for what we're actually going to see happening in the world. What if we turn to data use? Well, one of those mechanisms is still true. The desire to export policy vision is not limited to governance. It's also included in terms of how the BRICS use their data. And here, though, the concern is a little bit different, right? Before, it was about mirroring and maybe how can we provide positive incentives for you to use our technology, not someone else's. Here, there's a lot of concern about coercion. This has been most prominent with China's 5G network, right? We've heard about the dangers that it poses to citizen freedoms and the dangers that it poses to economic competition, with Huawei, for example, being a dominant force on the market in the world. This coercion raises questions about the extent to which this data use can be enforced. So if Huawei is the only one offering 5G services, who else are you going to turn to, right? This sort of, I don't know, monopoly, these monopoly problems arise. And this is where we also see data governance interacting with economic governance and making the whole sort of schlamassel a lot harder to solve. Another thing we can look at is that the BRICS have shared visions, right, like we talked about, but they also have shared fora. They meet regularly in different places, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, at the BRICS Forum, at the G20. And these kinds of things that they have could be used as a means of establishing a best practices dialogue for the Global South in relation to data use. We've already seen this a little bit. So there's an internet roundtable for emerging countries, and they've discussed already inviting other developing countries to come. And just like, I don't know if you follow the G7 and G8, it used to be that at the G7 and G8, they would invite other countries, so the O5, to come and visit. And they couldn't participate in any of the sessions, but they could come to the dinners and just listen and talk. This kind of format they also are considering using for the Internet Roundtable for emerging countries a couple of years ago, to get developing countries to come and sort of essentially absorb ideas from the BRICS countries. If it were more real cooperation, probably that would be better for the rest of the world. But in any case, there is the potential for the best practices dialogue establishing for the Global South that could really have an impact. So maybe just to conclude, the UN Development Program has a digital strategy, and they say digital is not a panacea, and there are places where it will not be useful. It's important to know when and when not to use technology. We couldn't agree more, all of me and my co-authors working on this project, but we would add to that, we would say you also have to know how to use it effectively, and you have to know in which context, domestic, geopolitical, it's likely to be most effective. Our goal is to contribute to those last bits, right? To see what we can contribute in making things work better in terms of the use of data in the developing world. That's it now. I'm done. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Laura. So we have 12 minutes, and we wanted to leave a lot of time to be able to have discussion. We know there are many people here that have done a great deal of work, both in international relations and then also in big data. And so we're really curious to begin this conversation, and in the hopes that it might be a longer conversation that emerges over time. So any initial questions or comments? Tony?
Hi, thanks so much for that talk, Laura. It's really fascinating. So many interesting issues. I guess I'm wondering if you have a comment on, often there's a characterization of some of the issues that you're talking about in terms of the global shift as involving tensions between democracies and authoritarianism. And since you've got India and South Africa, and you've also got Russia and China, I'm wondering, I mean, there were hints, points that you made that seemed to fit with that. But in these fora, do you think that's an important tension? And how does that interact with the sort of BRICS identity versus, the dominant powers and the rest of the world? So yeah, I'd be curious about your view on that one.
Thanks. Allison, should I just answer, or we're collecting? I can just answer.
Yeah, just answer.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks, Tony. And I'm glad you made it as well. Democracies versus authority, that's a huge issue in the literature. So I personally haven't looked at it, but I'm glad someone else does. There's a lot of findings if you look at internet governance specifically, that this is a big factor, that people who are more willing to accept the Chinese version of authoritarian governance are more willing to accept China's help and China's model of internet governance. There's a lot of people that disagree with this, though. Some people say that it has more to do with socioeconomic status. For example, how wealthy you are, how poor you are. Some people say it has to do with your dependence on the US. If you can actually substitute US dependence for Chinese dependence, and if that's going to ruin your foreign policy otherwise. So there's a lot of that. In terms of the BRICS, I think it is a problem, but the BRICS are they're very pragmatic in all of their policy making. So China and Russia clearly are on one side. There's a great paper from Leslie Armijo from 2007, where she essentially says China and Russia are way over here on this authoritarian democracy scale, and everybody else is way on the other side. And yet they still collaborate effectively. I think in terms of trade policy, for example, it's been very effective in terms of finding specific issues where we can make concessions, like on agricultural subsidies. And this has helped the BRICS sort of move past those problems without them being too much of an issue. I think you could say the same thing is true in this case. I think if they have something that they can all cohere to, and for which it's not going to be too costly to make some kind of concession, then they can do it. I think it could be a good platform for shared leadership. The question is whether they're willing to expend their resources on that. Because Brazil, for example, is in a much worse position than they used to be economically. And is digital governance going to be such a big deal when it's no longer a political platform for the president who's being spied on by the US, right? I don't know. I guess we'll see.
No one else jump in. I've got a question. You indicated that you've also been looking at data governance in the US and EU. And I think what part of the important context in thinking about the BRICS is, of course, the dominant powers and the power relations between them. And so I was hoping you could give us just a little bit about how you think about those interactions between the strategies that are being engaged in, particularly in the US versus those within the BRICS.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the US, if we're looking about, I had to admit, I haven't done much on big data in the US yet. Much of what we've done, and I've got slides because I thought maybe something like this would come up. Much of what we've done is look at different models of internet governance. So this is the one I was talking about, the multi-stakeholder model, which is like the prettiest internet governance model because everybody has a say all the time. The world is totally connected. Everybody's online. And the more connected you are, the better your life is. Unfortunately, this is all a theoretical model. And what we see in most of the time is this. We see Silicon Valley fighting with the EU, fighting with China to sort of set up their own technical spheres. And what we call this is then digital polarity, the idea that the world is polarizing in different respects. Our argument, or the argument that we're currently making and will hopefully submit by the end of the year to a journal, is that digital polarization is a process by which governments form technopoles, and that these technopoles then try to export their own regulations, their own infrastructures, their own companies as a means of making sure that all of those follower states stay with them, right? They stay in there within the thing. We see some polarization dynamics. Maybe this is too much detail, but you can look at the diagram if you want. The idea is that at the structural level, capabilities are concentrating. There's increasing coherence around the US, the EU, and China. And we're also seeing the US, the EU, and China engaging securitization dialogue, right? Essentially turning every digital thing into a security problem so that people will rally around the flag and want to join into your club. This then forces technopoles to behave in a certain way. Those technopoles continue to behave in a certain way, just like in an arms race, and then we end up back here, and this happens all over again. So essentially, we end up with this never-ending cycle that fragments the internet into a bunch of different groups. I think if you contextualize that with the BRICS, I think the BRICS would love to do that, but they can't, not collectively. China is the only one with the technological capability, although India is working on it. And they're also the only ones with kind of pure power capability to make this kind of stuff happen. So I think in terms of the US versus the BRICS, I think you can see some differences and some things in common. I mean, the US is a more committed supporter of open, transparent internet governance, open data, data sharing than is China or Russia, for sure. The US is very opposed to data localization. India will accept it on occasion. China and Russia are all about it and very happy to promote it. So I think there's a lot of sort of fine lines. And then this goes back to maybe what Tony was saying, right? About democracy versus authoritarianism, the extent to which you will accept these violations of your personal privacy as a means of facilitating a national goal. I know it kind of sidestepped your question, but it's just because I don't know too much about your question yet in terms of the US.
No, it's incredibly helpful and interesting. And actually, we got a question in the comment that you may have already answered, but I want to just sort of make sure that if there's any nuances to it. They're asking specifically about the influence role of the EU and US in terms of big data on the global South, probably beyond the BRICS.
Yeah, I think that certainly the EU and the US do try to exert an influence. I mean, that's part of this process, right? Is that the EU and the US want everybody in their camp, or to the extent that they can. If you look at the EU in particular, the EU is, known to be a normative power. They use laws the way that other people use guns, right? And if you look at, for example, the EU privacy laws, right, the general data protection regulations that came into effect a couple of years ago, these have really sneaky coercive bits in them, right? Like your company, if it doesn't meet these privacy regulations, cannot operate or cannot have any data exported to it by the EU. This is an old rule, actually. It's just been made more enforceable and more difficult to deal with in the GDPR. And what this means is that a lot of countries, particularly developing world countries, have started to change their laws in line with EU privacy regulations because they can't afford to lose the contact with the European countries. This is not a new idea. This is something the European Union's been doing since the 90s. But with the GDPR, which got so much play, you even see China doing it. China's data protection regulations, there was this interview with a Chinese official where they said that they were just waiting for the GDPR to come into effect so they could see what worked and what didn't, and then they would revise their laws accordingly. And so China's sort of using it as a building block for its own data protection regulations. I think certainly the US and the EU exert their influence, the EU through laws, the US through power.
Rian has a question about India's unique identification authority, and particularly the role and reinforcement of social identity and inequalities through this.
Whether the UIDI tries to do that, or what's the question?
Well,
exactly?
I'll read it directly.
Okay.
Can you talk a bit about, more about India and its unique identification authority? I'm curious about its role and the reinforcement of social identity and inequalities. Feel free, Reagan, to jump on and if you want to expand on that at all.
Yeah, I was just curious to see, like, given this newer technology, to see if it's like an informal reinforcement of the caste system, and if you've encountered like early results that suggest this.
Yeah, yes. So in German, they have something that's yes and no combined. It's jein, ja, and nein. And the answer, and it's one of the better words in the world, I think. We need one in English. You know, doesn't sound good. Anyway, Yes, I think the answer is yes and no. So the UADI, UIA, anyway, the Unique Identification Authority of India, like I said, markets AADHAAR as a means of overcoming these differences. Everybody, essentially, specifically the claim was that a lot of people in lower castes have their identities determined by relationships. So if the big guy in the village knows who you are, then you will have access to this, or he will vouch for you if you want to go look for a job in the village next door. Having your own personal unique ID should get you away from this, right? Because regardless of where you are and who you know, you're still the same person. I think in practice, it hasn't worked quite as well. And the interesting thing is that there's a paper, and now I've forgotten who wrote it. But if I find it, I can send it to Allison, she can forward it, or you can write me directly and I'll forward it to you. There's a paper about NGOs and their sort of political stance to AADHAAR. And the interesting thing is that at the beginning, the NGOs were very on board because they bought this message. They said, this is going to be liberating, it's going to be great. People are going to have more opportunities, more medical and health and economic and educational opportunities. But a lot of the bureaucracy of Indian politics essentially then neutralized their interest because they realized that all of the trouble that they would have to go through to make these things happen was beyond the scope of an NGO. And actually, it may be beyond the scope of some local Indian governments. And so as a result, a lot of times they weren't willing to go through the number of steps that they would need to do to make sure that those people at the bottom of the caste level, right, or the lowest caste level, were actually getting the benefits that were promised to them from this program. And they just decided they would just oppose it in general. So essentially, the amount of effort that was required was then too much trouble for them, and they went back to doing what they were doing before, which is, depending on the NGO, was whatever their job was. So yeah, I think certainly it intersects. I don't think the UIDAI did it on purpose. I think probably a lot of the problem is the Indian. There's 1.3 billion people who are citizens of India, and they all have a right to speak because it's a democratic country, which makes it a little bit harder to implement things like that. I hope that answers your question.
Katya had a question where she wanted to kind of follow up on the idea of the formation of Technopoles and the debate that's really raging around the breaking up of big tech. I don't know if you want to speak more to that, Katya.
Yeah, hi. It's good to see you again, Laura. Long time no see. Great presentation. Yeah, I was following the discussion now a little bit more from the external side, since we're not working together on this anymore. And I wonder what your thoughts are on the current debate, because now what we see is, you mentioned the technopoles and this whole strategy to form big technopoles. And you could see this in the BRIC countries, especially how successful they're also doing that, right? And on the other hand, in Europe and the US, what we see is kind of a splitting of this traditional notion of a technopole, because here we talk about the split up and the breakup of the big tech, and it seems like the visions, the policy visions, are not matching the technology and development and economic visions anymore. So do you see, or do you foresee from also the corpus of knowledge that you've built up in the last years, that this could actually result in something that the American-based big tech companies are currently calling out, which means losing everything to China, and also talking about security issues and how this will open up a new whole problem space for security issues? Is that the direction where we will go now?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I see everybody. Katja Meyer is my co-author on a lot of the papers in this. However, not on this last one, which is a different Meyer, because Meyer is a very popular name in Germany. But yes, anyway, Katja, good to have you here. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think that we see some division, although I would disagree with you that the US and the EU are focused on the breaking of big tech companies. I think if it's their big tech company, they don't want to break it up. I would say that you see this a lot at the European Commission has been releasing, I think it was like a 1.3 billion euro fund for the creation of national tech champions in Europe. That's the opposite of breaking up tech companies. That's the creation of tech companies, because only by representing the EU on the global stage is the EU going to be able to affect the kinds of things that are happening at the global level. I think that's their argument. And I would say in the US, the same argument is happening. Now, whether this means that the policy visions disappear, that's a good question. I think if China had its way, China would set the tone for the developing world. I think the US would say the same and the EU would say the same. So the question then is what scope there is for the BRICS to do anything about it. And this is where we have to look and see whether there's potential for these shared policy concerns, this idea that we care about development as a big data thing. We care about the government effectiveness and efficiency improving. Is that something we care about enough? Or do we care more about our geopolitical position and the way that we can use data and economic power and military power to influence what's going on in the world more broadly? And I think that's where we're headed. I think we're headed into sort of this dynamic where governments, as usual, have to sort of pit two different policy goals against one another and decide in which context, which one is more doable and which one do we care about more. And that's what we'll see. We'll find out.
Okay, thanks.
We have about 5 minutes left. I, of course, always have more questions. So I have another question, but I wanted to check first if anyone else does. All right, I am not seeing hands or comments. So, Tony, was that you?
Yeah, maybe I'll just follow up on the sort of issue of the geo-economic competition. And when you were talking about your analysis of the tweets and the sort of domestic engagement with big data issues, I'm wondering if this sort of nationalistic concern about, employment and the success of tech companies works into that more widespread popular discussion, or is this something that you think stays more at the governmental level?
Well, it was interesting because the tweeters actually, there was a big competition for who would get to do the tech of AADHAAR. And it was promoted by the government as a worldwide competition. Which tech company is going to be dominant? And actually big companies all over the world bid, right? Microsoft was involved, IBM was involved. Big tech companies from the US, I don't know if there are big tech companies in the EU, but big tech companies for all the world were interested. And it ultimately went to an Indian company, to Mindtree, who got the bid. Then the government, of course, was saying, hey, Indian power, they had the best offer, blah, 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 whatever. The tweeters, on the other hand, were more interested in sort of the status sort of that came with having beat Microsoft, which I think was slightly different emphasis than what the government had, right? The government was talking about our tech power is better. That's why the offer was better. And the tweeters were like, hey, this is a moment of national pride for the Indian people, because not only are we going to set up this super cool thing, but we're going to do it using Indian technology. And something I didn't mention, but which is true in AADHAAR, is that one of the ways that the government cultivated legitimacy for the program is they appointed Nandan Nilekani, who was one of the co-creators of Infosys, to be the leader of the UADI, the first one. So he was essentially like the magnet, right? It was like, look at our great tech guy. We created this guy. He created Infosys, which everybody in the world knows. And now he's in charge of this government program, and he's going to do a great job. Listen to what he has to say. And people did. And the tweeters were very impressed by his appointment. They were very impressed by the Indian winning of this competition. And I might maybe last point add that they also gave the Indian people the chance to create the logo of AADHAAR, which was also apparently a really big thing. They got a whole lot of submissions. And then I can't remember who won it. Anyway, whoever it was that won it, they got some kind of big award, and they got to like meet Nandan Nilekani and like go to a big governmental event, and it was very widely publicized. So I think, yeah, I think that's a good point, that this tech company thing does show up, but it's maybe viewed a little bit differently by the tweeters than it was intended by the government.
just a quick, as a methodologist, I have to ask sausage making questions. I'm curious, because you were doing a document review and then also sentiment analysis with Twitter in different languages, whether you were using a form like Google Voice, or you were actually having people do kind of the nuanced translation into, I don't know if you were doing this in German or English, but into whatever language you were working with.
The sentiment analysis was primarily done in English, because almost all the tweets discussing AADHAAR were in English.
Right, it's India.
It's India. So we didn't have a problem with that. Now, when we were doing the analysis of the tweets, the qualitative analysis, we did have some tweets in Hindi, right? They weren't all in English. And so those we used automatic translators to translate. And then we had a couple of friends who actually were Indian natives, and they were willing to check our translations. So they looked at the Hindi translations, sort of spot checking them to see if it worked. So the qualitative was multilingual. The quantitative was just in English. And actually, this goes for my paper with Katya as well, because there we had the problem with Portuguese, Chinese, and English.
All right, we are right at 11:30. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us here at McMaster. We have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, well, it's great to be here, and I hope to hear more from your series. It looks like a really great place. Y'all got a lot going on.
All right, everyone, have a wonderful day.
Bye, you too.